Hello everyone. Today I would like to discuss the various forms of legislation that exist within the European Union. These are the regulation, the directive, the decision, and the recommendation or opinion. First, it is very important to remark that secondary legislation can only be adopted by the European legislature when this falls within their competencies as is dictated by the primary legislation. The primary legislation is usually the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union or the Treaty on the European Union. Please note that secondary law is usually used by the European legislature to harmonize particular legislation within the European Union. A regulation is legislation that applies within the European Union without the interference of a national legislature. Traditionally, this is the strongest legislative tool that can be used by the European legislature, and it basically comes down to this. When the regulation is adopted, the content of the regulation applies within the European Union without any interference of the national parliaments, and that is that. A very good example of a regulation is the regulation on the processing of personal data. The lawfulness of processing someone's private data, as you can find in Article 6 of this regulation, applies in the entire European Union in a similar way. A directive is slightly different compared to a regulation. In a directive, you will find general principles or goals that need to be adopted. It is up to the member states to implement this directive the way they see fit before a given deadline. This basically means that the principles and goals that are given within this directive are harmonized within the European Union. However, the way this is implemented might differ per country. A very good example of a directive is the Product Liability Directive. Article 16 of this directive stipulates that member states may adopt a maximum liability of damage compensation of a defective product. However, this maximum liability may not be lower than 70 million euros. As we see in Germany, for instance, this is 85 million euros, and in the UK there is no maximum. Please note that the directive may be as directly applicable as a regulation as long as the content of the directive is specific enough to be directly applied. When a member state does not meet the deadline, for instance, then the directly applicable articles of the directive may still be used by the citizens of the European Union. A decision is legislation that only applies to an individual case. An example could be when the European legislature decides to help funding a particular country that is in financial need. Last but not least, we have recommendations and opinions. Usually, a recommendation is written by the European Commission to voice their opinion about particular law that we might need. An opinion is written by the other institutions of the European Union, in which they also advise on how to understand particular legislative concepts. However, both the recommendation and the opinion are not legally binding. After watching this movie, I hope you understand a little bit more about the different forms of legislation, secondary legislation, we have within the European Union. Thank you very much for watching. For more information, please check www.drwernaart.com or like Dr. Wernaart at Facebook. That is www.facebook.com/drwernaart.